WTAP looks back on this day in history in today's We the People, celebrating 250 years.
A battalion of the U.S. 9th Infantry Division leaves Saigon in the initial withdrawal of U.S. troops. The 814 soldiers were the first of 25,000 troops that were withdrawn in the first stage of the U.S. disengagement from the Vietnam War. There would be 14 more increments in the withdrawal, but the last U.S. troops did not leave until after the Paris Peace Accords were signed in January 1973.
A moment to reflect, a time to remember. Join WTAP in celebrating We the People. Watch This Day in History every day on WTAP News at 6, proudly sponsored by WVU Medicine Camden Clark. Now, here